So, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Christophe Janscreux, Head of the Electricity Department in ACER. So, welcome to all of you for this joint webinar with the Joint Research Center, so JRC. The theme of the day will be how to ensure sufficient grid capacities in the European electricity market. Needless to say that this ensuring sufficient grid capacity in the electricity market is a fundamental prerequisite to many things. First, to improve the functioning of the market, to improve security of supply, but more broadly, this is an important prerequisite for the decarbonization, the ambitious decarbonization objective. So today you will have two reports for the price of one. The first report is an ACER report on cross-zonal transmission capacity with a focus on the 70%, on the fulfillment of the 70%. So it will be presented by Ignacio Munoz Guerin Garcia. Why do we focus on cross-zonal capacity? As you know, since the establishment of ACER, ACER has constantly been focusing on this topic because we strongly believe that interconnection have a critical role to play. We highlighted recently during the crisis all the benefits of interconnection in terms of social welfare benefit, with 34 billion a year of benefits linked to cross-border trade. We also showed the impact of interconnector to mitigate the price volatility. Just as a reminder, the volatility of price during the energy crisis would have been 7 times higher without cross-border trade. But we also saw during this crisis the importance of interconnection for the resilience and the security of supply of the internal electricity market. And maybe the last reason of this focus on interconnection and cross-zonal capacity is also because we know that interconnection are a critical source of flexibility, and that we need this flexibility to facilitate the integration of renewable in the European market. So this will be the first report, 15-minute presentation by Ignacio, and then we will have a second presentation by George Thomassen, and this time it's on the JRC's report. The JRC's report is a more forward-looking assessment which was recently published by JRC on the evolution of congestion costs in Europe if we keep the current European market design. So for this report, I will, of course, let George to present the main finding of their report, but you will see that these findings are very interesting, and here I see the link between the two reports, because with this conclusion, with this JRC report, it helped us to shed some light on the difficulties, challenges, but also potential solution to increase cross-zonal capacity. So this is the reason why I think the two reports are linked, and the reason why we decided to have this joint webinar with JRC. So each presentation, and we can go to the agenda, each presentation will last 15 minutes. It will be followed by each will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. The first one will be moderated by Patrick Luix, and the second one by Silvia Vitiello from JRC. And then we will conclude with some closing remark from Christine Vlaxma from JRC. Voila, without further ado, I will pass the floor to Ignacio, but maybe just to repeat some housekeeping rules first, just to let you know that this meeting is recorded. The slide and the recording of the webinar will be uploaded on our website. You have the possibility to pose your question using the Slido tool within Microsoft Teams. You can see the link here on the slide. You can like the question raised by a participant to increase their visibility. And if you have more substance-related questions, we will try to address them during the relevant Q&A session. Then I will now pass the floor to Ignacio for the first presentation.
Many thanks, Christophe. I will take it from here. Could you confirm, Christophe, that you can see the slides moving, right? All right, then I will briefly introduce myself. So I'm Ignacio Muñoz-Gura, and I'm a policy officer here in the ACER electricity market monitoring team, and I have been the main drafter of this market monitoring report, which we published mid last week. Actually, it's quite fresh on transmission capacities for cross-zonal trade and congestion management. My objective today is to give you a brief overview of all of the content of this report and what are the main findings. Before we start, I will just reiterate something that Christophe mentioned, and is that we will have a Q&A right after my intervention. So feel free to start posting questions using the Slido app so that we can tackle them as soon as we reach the Q&A part. Starting with a bit the scope and structure of this report. So this is a continuation in the 2024 series of ACER market monitoring reports. In fact, it's the fourth market monitoring report that we published this year, and the second that covers electricity markets. As with all ACER market monitoring reports, our mandate is related to assessing barriers to the completion of the internal market for both electricity and gas in the European Union. And this particular report assesses barriers that are related to the availability of cross-zonal capacity for electricity trade. So we intended to have an overview of how capacity is calculated and offered in different market timeframes and across different capacity regions. One of the main focuses of this report, as it has been historically, is the implementation of the minimum 70% requirement. So we intend to track progress and bottlenecks in how this requirement is implemented in the EU. We will touch upon this more in detail in a few slides, and also to assess potential impacts of the current market structure, the current bidding zone configuration on market efficiency. Now, briefly on the structure of the report, as you will see, it's structured into three main sections. The first one presenting a bit of an overview of the principles guiding capacity calculation in the EU, explaining the key concepts that are then used throughout the report, and presenting some high-level indicators on the level of interconnectivity of the different EU member states, how capacities are offered, and how they have been evolving over the last few years. Again, in different market time units, in different market timeframes, and different regions. The second chapter is more specifically on the margin available for cross-zonal trade. So the portion of physical capacity on interconnectors that's being made available for cross-zonal trade in the EU. This replaces our historical 70% assessment. And for the first time this year, since there's a quite strong link between how TSOs manage congestions in their grid with how much capacity is being offered, we also assess level of congestion management needs in the EU, measured by the need for TSOs to intervene to adjust the market outcome via redispatching, via counter trading, to ensure that grid congestion is tackled. Now, if I move on to the next slide, I reiterate a bit of what Christophe mentioned at the beginning. So it's a topic that we're giving quite high priority here at ACER, and specifically in the market monitoring team, as we see the need for further access to neighboring markets. In fact, the need to maximize access to neighboring markets to support the rapid uptake of renewable energy sources in the power system. This is true across all market timeframes, but especially true for timeframes closer to real time, as renewable systems benefit especially from trading close to real time. In fact, we see that a large share of the flexibility gap of moving to high renewable systems will need to be covered by interconnector. And this plays out in two dimensions. So on the one side, we have the need to roll out cross-border electricity infrastructure to further interconnect markets. Here, every interconnector is subject to a cost-benefit analysis, and it's not specifically the focus on this report. What it is how efficiently the current infrastructure is being used. That's what we focus on. On the figure in the slide, you have one of the indicators that we use to assess the level of interconnectivity of different EU member states. So in this particular case, we measure the percentage of the peak demand of every member state that can be covered on average with import capacities from neighboring markets. So we assess what's the import capacity of every member state, and we divide that by the peak demand of each member state. What we see, in fact, is quite high disparities depending on the member states. There's multiple reasons for that. So there's geographical reasons, there's the level of investment in cross-border infrastructure, but another one that plays a key role is the degree of optimization of the current network, and that's a bit what we focus on in this report. So there's at least two aspects to that. So how capacity is calculated and the level of implementation of coordinated processes to calculate capacities at the regional level, which we see that can significantly increase the levels of interconnectivity of EU member states, and the 70% requirement, which is another key driver to this. So starting briefly with the capacity calculation processes, as you may know, the obligation to coordinate capacity calculation between TSOs at the regional level stems mostly from these two regulations that you have on slide. So for the shorter time frames, day ahead and intraday, it's the CACIM regulation, which was implemented in 2015, and the FCA regulation for the longer term time frames. Through multiple analysis that we do in the report, we see that there's notable benefits from increasing coordination and improving how we calculate capacities at the regional level. One example that we have in the report is this figure on the right, where we measure how monthly average import and export capacities at the bidding zone level are evolving over time, in particular in the core region. And there we see a significant jump from where flow-based is expanded from only the CWE, so a subset of the bidding zone borders in now core region, to the whole core region. And a significant increase in the trading possibilities of the region. And you see that, so the core flow-based capacity calculation was implemented in mid-2022. Since then, we see, especially in the countries that move from an NTC model to a flow-based model, which models a subset of the network and allows the market coupling algorithm to use the capacity on each network element in a way that maximizes welfare. There's a significant jump in how much bidding zones can export or import. On this aspect, we still see room for improvement in some EU regions, as coordinated processes are not yet fully implemented all across the EU. An example of this is the Nordic capacity calculation region that still functions on a quite national basis for calculating capacities, and where we expect flow-based to be implemented throughout this year. Now, moving on to specifically the 70% requirement, as I mentioned, one of the focuses of this report. So as you may be aware, the 70% requirement refers to the obligation introduced in the Clean Energy Package for TSOs to offer at least 70% of their physical capacities on interconnectors and other network elements that are relevant for capacity calculation, so what we call connects, to offer at least 70% of that physical capacity to market for cross-zonal trade. This requirement came into force in 2020, but the regulation allowed for a progressive implementation of the requirement up until 2025 through the use of both derogations, which are granted yearly by the national regulatory authorities, and multi-year action plans for TSOs or member states to address structural congestion within bidding zones up until the end of 2025. The figure on the right shows what's the current status of implementation in the sense of which member states have an applicable derogation or an applicable action plan, or both, in the year 2023, although it hasn't changed much in 2024. We do see that there's still a significant share of member states and TSOs that rely on these derogations or action plans. which effectively reduce the applicable requirements of cross-zonal capacity. So these TSOs, they're not bound by 70% at the moment. They are bound by interim requirements, which are defined in the action plans and in the derogations. And these interim requirements, they might be static, as in the case of the German TSOs, for instance, which defines one target that is constant for all hours of the year and all connects used in capacity calculation. But it might also be dynamic, that it changes depending on the connect and depending on the hour. Now, this implementation of the 70% requirement is something that ACER monitors yearly since 2020. And we do so in line with a monitoring methodology that is published under ACER Recommendation 01/2019, and which has been approved in the NRA community, and which is non-binding. So it's not necessary for all NRAs to use this monitoring methodology when assessing the compliance of their TSO. And that's one point we would like to make, that this report is not intended as a compliance assessment on the obligations derived from the electricity regulation. In fact, we want to track progress and see how far we are from implementing the requirements. So from the end goal, more than the current requirements. And lastly, our monitoring covers at the moment mostly the day-ahead time frame, but this is something that we will plan to progressively expand to the intraday time frame as well. So the question that we wanted to answer was where we stand in 2023. So we collect data from TSOs on a yearly basis on their capacity calculation, and we make an assessment for all capacity calculation regions to which extent both the transitional interim requirements are met, but also on more absolute levels, how far we are from 70%. So what's the margins of capacity that are being offered by each of the TSOs, and what are the reasons behind the different levels of capacity that are offered. And by doing so, we come out with this result. So in this case, in the slide, we show the results for the core capacity calculation region specifically, although other regions are covered in the report. On the figure on the left, we assess to which extent the interim requirements are met, and we do see that indeed in 2023, these interim requirements have been generally met by the core TSOs. Yet, however, this does not always translate into progress towards 70%, into being closer to offering 70% of capacity. And that is because, as I mentioned, some of the derogations may apply dynamic targets, most notably due to loop flows. And whenever forecasted loop flows are high or are increasing, the applicable requirements can also decrease. So we see in the figure on the right, more on absolute terms, the progress towards 70%, and we do see that it's not obvious. There's a large range of capacities that are being offered by TSOs, some being still rather far from 70%, and the progress is not linear. So we compared the capacities offered in 2022 since the implementation of the core flow-based in order to ensure that they're fully comparable, and the values for 2023, and we see that there are improvements in some TSOs, but that's not necessary across the whole region. So in fact, with these conclusions, we see that until the reasons for derogations are fully tackled, the implementation deadline of 2025 may be put at risk, may not be achieved. On the next slide, so because we see that to a large extent, the margins of capacity offered are based on how TSOs can manage grid congestion within bidding zones, we consider relevant also to make an assessment here on the levels of congestion management needs that TSOs report. And we collect data from national regulatory authorities for this. And generally, over the last few years, we have been seeing an upward trend in the needs for TSOs to intervene to alter the market outcome through redispatching and counter trading in the EU. In fact, in 2023, the total volume of redispatching and counter trading, so what we call remedial actions, reached almost 60 terawatt-hour and came at a total cost for the EU system of 4.2 billion. In the figure on the right, we see the trend over the last 4 years for the case of Germany, which is particularly relevant, as roughly half of the volume of the whole EU and half of the cost of the whole EU is borne by the German system. Now, the colleagues from the JRC will expand more on the projections for the future, but we do see that this trend could be further exacerbated in the short term, mainly due to 2 reasons. So on the one hand, we will see the phase out of action plans and derogation in the coming years, which means that 70% requirement will be fully applicable across the whole EU. And continuous penetration of renewable energies. And this might lead to increasing network congestion. That is, of course, unless grid expansion manages to keep pace with these two other drivers, and or there's a reconfiguration of the bidding zones to align them more with structural network congestion. I see that I'm already running a bit out of time, so some concluding remarks from my side. So again, we see that the availability of cross-zonal capacities are key, and the maximization of the availability of cross-zonal capacities is key to the net zero ambitions of the EU, as they are somehow a precondition for further market integration. We see that at the moment, some TSOs in some regions are still far off from their obligations with regards to 70%. So we see that significant effort will still be needed to ensure that 70% can be reached by the end of 2025. And the means to achieve that are well known, and we have reported on them for the last few years. So it's the swift implementation of coordinated processes. So mostly, as I mentioned, capacity calculation methodologies, but also the congestion management framework to ensure that there's coordination in how TSOs address congestion and cost sharing. On the more mid or long-term grid investments to reduce the share of loop and internal flows on connects, allowing that more share of the capacity can be offered for cross-zonal trade. And when unable to consistently meet 70% after 2025, potentially to improve the bidding zone configuration. And lastly, as mentioned, so the penetration of renewable energy sources into the system calls for more attention to the capacities that can be offered and the margins of capacities that can be offered in the intraday timeframe. So this is something that will call for our attention in coming reports. That's it from me as an overview of the report. So I now hand over to Patrick for the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you for the presentation. Now, not wasting some Patrick Lux, also from ACER, team leader on the market monitoring on electricity topics. And I can say you have been quite active in asking questions, so we'll not beat around the bush and dive straight in the questions to forward to Ignacio. Maybe the first question that also has the most votes, Ignacio, is so many countries have no derogations or action plans and are still not meeting the 70%. So what are the consequences for these countries?
So indeed, now every case is specific, so I don't want to generalize. In the core region, we see that 3 member states currently don't have either a derogation or an action plan. So that's Czechia, that's Slovenia, and that's France. Out of those 3, both Slovenia and Czechia can be considered to have generally already been able to offer 70%. In the case of France, that has not been the case yet. So indeed, due to network congestion, they have needed to reduce capacities on occasion to guarantee system security. So that's one case. Another case that we see is the one in the Nordics, where it's more a matter of the monitoring approach. And because there's no coordinated capacity calculation yet implemented, it's quite difficult for us to monitor to which extent 70% is offered or not. So so for that, we're looking forward to flow-based being implemented so that we can have an accurate picture of what are the margins of capacity being offered in the Nordic member states.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. I also already see some questions that will be more for JRC colleagues afterwards, so I will skip these for now. But the next question for you, Ignacio, is the rationale behind the threshold of the 70%. So is there any insights you can give on why the 70% or how the threshold should evolve in the future?
Yes, that's a very good question, actually. So it might be the case that the 70% is not necessarily an economic optimum, as it could be that in order for a TSO to guarantee 70%, it needs to incur in higher redispatching costs to ensure 70% than the welfare benefits that are obtained by offering 70%, yet it's a way to internalize the grid congestion of each TSO. So in the end, the TSO that will face congestion and will not be able to offer 70% will need to bear the redispatching costs.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question, I also see some statements in here, which I will skip for now. But the next question is, people on your slide 10 saw that there was a downward trend between moving from 22 to 23. So one slide back, I think slide 10.
This one here, yeah.
Yeah, this one. And so I'm guessing it's the right-hand side. So is there any qualitative explanation for this counterintuitive effect? So why do we see a decrease in some countries?
Indeed, it can be a counterintuitive effect. It's mostly related to the countries that have an applicable derogation. In the core region, there's several member states that have several TSOs that have a derogation based on loop flows. So they discount from either 70% or their action plan target. They discount the share of loop flow above a certain threshold that they forecast. So in that sense, the applicable requirement that they will need to meet is largely dependent on how many loop flows they forecast. So it could be the case that for one certain year over another, the loop flows that they forecast are on average higher or more concentrated on certain connects, and thus the margins of capacity may be lowered from one year to the next. So it's I would say a direct effect from the applicable derogations.
Thank you, Ignacio. And then someone who announces his question as maybe politically sensitive, but is there any visible knock-on effect on EU borders following the UK being removed from the single day-ahead market coupling? Is there anything we can say on this?
I mean, it will have more of an effect, of course, in capacity allocation than in capacity calculation. So this report focused mostly on the first part, on capacity calculation. It does have an impact, as now core TSOs are moving towards implementing advanced hybrid coupling, which presupposes that the country outside of the region is integrated into STAC. So that will not be possible for the links with the UK. So it will be a less efficient way of calculating capacities in that region.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's still time for one or two questions, and we'll try to address the rest maybe in the chat if we can. But otherwise, you can always reach out to us if there's really pregnant questions that we have not answered. But here's one. If we have looked into the redispatching requirements of other EU countries in addition to Germany in our report, Ignacio.
Yes, we do. So we collect data on redispatching from all EU NRAs that can effectively provide it. We assess the case of Germany here as it's the largest one. So relatively, it covers half of the redispatching volumes and cost we see in Germany. So it's the most relevant one. But in the report, we assess several countries, and we also look into the share of renewable energies that it's being curtailed due to grid congestion in several countries. Also, there Germany is currently number one, but other EU member states are also popping up there.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. Then I will round up by just taking a couple of questions that I will not ask you, but just refer to upcoming ACER work or to actually our JRC colleagues. So I see a question on the interconnections as a flexibility source and how this could be measured. Well, that's a nice question, but that's actually one of the tasks ACER has just gotten under the electricity market design reform. So an answer that we hope to give in, let's say, 2 years, 3 years. So bear with us for a while. There's also a question about how much the congestion revenue would be expected to be if the 70% is to be met. That's maybe more question that the JRC can maybe shed light on because it's more forward-looking. And I think I will close it here. I also see it's time for JRC colleagues to take over. Thank you very much, Ignacio. And I will now gladly hand over the floor to Georg. Georg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is the perfect lead up to our presentation as well. I am Georg Thomassen from the Joint Research Center at the European Commission, and I'm happy to present our report, our forward-looking exercise with regard to redispatch in the European system. So I hope now the slides are also where they are supposed to be. Please write your questions, all that you might have, onto the Slido page, and then we will have a second Q&A session where we will also address all the questions that you asked with regard to our assessment. Okay, so maybe some words on the background of our study. What is the setting? So we see that renewable deployment is gaining pace in the wake of the European gas crisis of 2022. Recently, the European Commission proposed a 90% emissions reduction target by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. And we are all aware that this target relies largely on the deployment of distributed renewables, such as wind and solar PV. At the same time, as the colleagues from ACER already outlined, we see increasing redispatch volumes in the European system in the context of renewable deployment. Also, we have the bidding zone review ongoing currently, which investigates suitable reconfigurations of the European market zones with the aim of reducing structural congestion in the system. So in this context, we asked ourselves, how will redispatch develop in the EU in the medium to long term? And what are the implications for decarbonization as well as the viability of the zonal market design? First, a couple of words on the underlying scenario that we used for this assessment. This scenario is aligned with the impact assessment for the 2040 target on essential aspects, such as total installed renewable capacity, total installed electrolysis capacity, as well as electricity demand for all other purposes. It assumes a quadrupling of variable renewable capacity by 2030 and another doubling by 2040, all of course in reference to 2020 levels. So you can see on the right that this is a massive upscaling of renewable capacity that we see in the system. And I think this we also need to keep in the back of our head when we talk about the results of our assessment. We go basically from roughly 250 gigawatts in 2020 to more than 2,000 gigawatts of wind and solar in the European system by 2040. We assume that renewables inside each country are distributed in proportion to local generation potential. So what does this mean? Basically, if we have a geographical area with more land available for renewable installations, it will get more capacity. And if we have higher capacity factors in a certain area, so a lower LCOE because we can produce more clean energy with the same installation, then we also have more capacity going to this region. With regard to heat pumps and electric vehicles, they were modeled as flexible demand with load shifting capability. So the total sum of demand needs to be met, but we have some degree of flexibility when the demand is being met. And electrolysis was modeled as fully price responsive. The geospatial distribution we assumed for this was in proportion to installed renewables. So we basically that if we have more renewables in a certain area, we have more electrolysis, but we also have some electrolysis, for example, in areas with less renewables, for example, because we might have industrial demand and so on. With regard to the methodology, we use the open source model of the European Transmission Grid Pipes AUR as the base model. On top of this model, we build custom routines for grid expansion at the European and national level, for flow-based market coupling and for redispatch. You can see the workflow on the right here. And this model was further validated with a backtesting exercise where we aim to replicate 2020 redispatch volumes according to the ACER market monitoring report, as you can see here on the bottom. And we believe that these volumes align quite well, and therefore we are confident that we are able to capture the general trends in the system going forward. Then with regard to the grid expansion scenarios, I saw that there were already some questions. We will address them after this presentation. So we investigated 3 grid expansion scenarios. They are based on German data, simply because when we started doing this study, that was the best databases available to our knowledge. So the BAU scenario describes a grid expansion based on current trends. We looked at how many lines were built, how many kilometers of lines were laid in Germany in the last 10 years. And if we extrapolate this to 2040, we end up with a business as usual scenario of 10% reinforcements and newly built line extension of the total circuit length. And we extrapolate this to each country, not just to Germany. Then we have the extreme grid expansion scenario, which is based on the NDP, the Network Development Plan, on Netzentwicklungsplan, which foresees a 35% increase in total circuit length. So basically building 1/3 of the existing grid on top of what we already have. This is the basis for the extreme grid expansion scenario, where we had 35% of expansion in each country in Europe. And then we took a middle of the road scenario, so the ambitious grid expansion scenario, which is considering a speed up compared to the current trend, compared to the business as usual scenario. So we double the deployment speed, but not yet to the level of the extreme grid expansion scenario. With this, we go to the results. So we see that redispatch increases substantially across all investigated scenarios. We have in 2040 2 of the 3 scenarios that result in redispatch volumes in the order of magnitude of the electricity demand in France or Germany. But even in the extreme grid expansion scenario, where we are assuming an expansion in line with a 35% expansion of total circuit length, we still end up with a 6-fold increase compared to 2022 levels, so almost 300 terawatt hours of redispatch. If we go to the costs, the costs for redispatching measures increased to 34 billion, according to our scenarios, in the extreme grid expansion scenario in 2040. With low grid expansion, they could be even as high as 103 billion euros in 2040. We also assume that these costs are likely over-optimistic, because we assume a cost-based redispatch mechanism. But it is questionable whether we can actually handle these volumes in bilateral contracts, because, as I said, we are in the order of magnitude of the electricity demand of France and Germany in the AGE and the BAU scenario. Also, in market-based settings, as we are, for example, in Spain, we can assume the substantial intake gaming, because we know that it increases with the volume of redispatch, which would then further increase the volumes of redispatch, so we would actually have more redispatch than we assessed here at the moment. If we look into renewables, we observe substantial renewable curtailment due to grid congestion. Here we can see it on the right. So the light blue bars, they describe market-based curtailment. So basically, it was not possible for the operators of renewable installations to sell their electricity in the market, while the darker blue bars, they describe grid-based curtailment. So basically, the electricity was sold in the market, but then it was not possible to deliver it to the consumers. And in the extreme grid expansion scenario, we see 100 terawatt hours of renewable generation being at risk of being curtailed in 2040 due to bottlenecks. In the business as usual scenario, this goes up to 310 terawatt hours of curtailment of renewable generation in the same year. What we take away from these numbers is that we need to steer more actively where renewables are being deployed to minimize strain on the grid. Then we had an assessment of the impact of flexible demand. For this, we employed a very conservative estimation because so we only looked at redispatch being triggered at the node where demand is located, because otherwise we would have to do full A/B modeling where we use it without and with the flexible demand. So this is still a conservative estimation. In this context, we found little impact of demand shifting on redispatch by heat pumps and electric vehicles. However, we saw that hydrogen generates significant additional redispatching needs. To us, this highlights the importance of steering where electrolysis plants are going to be built in the system. So what can we do to address these challenges lying ahead? We can, of course, tackle investment decisions, target them with better incentives, or we can target operational decisions. And we believe that both investment decisions and operational incentives need to be addressed. So if we look at investment, we can add a locational component to existing and planned auction mechanisms, for example, for renewable auctions, capacity markets, and hydrogen, to better steer where these new investments go and get a better balanced system. And we could also, of course, look towards locational grid charges, for example, deep connection charges or operational charges, which then affect the cost-benefit analysis of investors when they decide where to place an investment. With regard to operations, of course, we can look into bidding zone splits that can reduce congestion if they improve the representation of bottlenecks in the market clearing process. And of course, there's always the option of locational and marginal pricing, which can achieve far-reaching alignment between market operations with the physical reality. This brings me already to the key insights and the policy recommendations. So we see that redispatch volumes in all scenarios increase massively until 2040. Even with higher levels of grid expansion, the total redispatch volumes increase almost sixfold by 2040. At lower rates, redispatch volumes could well match today's electricity consumption in countries like France or Germany. Major volumes of renewable energy are at risk of being curtailed due to grid congestion. Hydrogen production was further identified as a redispatch driver across all investigated scenarios and target years. Therefore, we believe that investment incentives should be improved by adding a locational component to existing and planned auction mechanisms. Bidding zone splits further that improve the representation of congestion in the market clearing process should be implemented. And we further recommend the cost-benefit analysis of LMP in a climate-neutral electricity system with high shares of variable renewables to settle once and for all whether this is a necessary feature of a climate-neutral electricity system or not. And lastly, I would like to stress that it is vital that this issue is addressed as soon as possible, since the period until 2040 is essential to manage where renewables and hydrogen generation are located. It is now in the next 15, 16 years where we build the infrastructure. Once it is placed, we can only deal with the system we have, but now we still have an impact on how the system is going to be designed. Many thanks for the attention, and I will hand over to Sylvia for the Q&A. One last thing. Here we have still a link to the study. Yeah. Sorry, Sylvia, over to you.
Thanks, Georg, and to ACER colleagues. I'm Silvia Vitiello. I'm the project leader for the project Energy Markets, Transmission and Distribution at the European Commission Joint Research Center. Georg, we have plenty of questions, so I would start without much further ado from the first one. The first question which was asked was that about the assumption of our study. So do you think that the likelihood of the three scenarios that are selected to materialize are appropriate? Scenario 3, so which is actually the business as usual, as it would reflect today's grid planning, and scenario 1, is it the worst case scenario? So as a follow-up also, the German regulator repeatedly stated that they expect a sharp increase in project approvals in terms, I think, projects for transmission capacity and commissioning. So where the truth is standing? There will be massive transmission capacity projects or not?
Yes, thanks a lot for this question. First of all, I would like to highlight we did not put any likelihoods or any probabilities on these scenarios of how likely they are to materialize. We see, and it is promising, that there's an increase in the speed that the projects in Germany are being accepted and are being developed. Of course, we need to stress also that this is not only a German matter, so this is a European matter. We need to have strong grid reinforcements across the whole European system, and if this happens, then we are very happy about this. We will not be the ones complaining about member states reinforcing the system, but we see it as a necessity going forward. And this is also what we wanted to stress with this report, how important grid expansion measures are going forward.
Okay, Gareth, then the attendants would like some more details about the model used. So, for example, one question is about how the costs to solve congestions are calculated, so the cost of redispatch, and why PIPES-EUR is used instead of a 10Y-NDP grid model, which is validated by the DSOs. So the person asking this question also mentioned that the PIPES-EUR tool seems to be quite realistic for the German system, but its validity, according to him or her, could be questionable for other countries.
So first of all, so why did we not use the TY-NDP model? Two things. As far as I am informed, the TY-NDP model has only 100 zones in Europe, and there is research that suggests that this resolution is not sufficient to capture redispatch measures and to capture all of grid congestion. But if you go towards a certain reduction of the grid, then you will lose information and you will get less redispatch than it would actually have in reality. Secondly, with regard to the grid model, this is why we perform the validation process. This is why I can go back to the slide. We modeled redispatch and compared it with 2020 values. We did this very thoroughly. We used the same climate data of 2020, and we get very similar values, I would say. And therefore, we are confident that we're actually capturing with this model the general trends in the system. Was there another part to the question, Sylvia, that I'm forgetting now?
It's about the validity, but I think we can actually move forward with the questions. So another question, which I think it's a bit outside the scope of this research, but still interesting to address, is okay, if we see that a member state has structured congestion for more than 15 years, and this creates bottlenecks, can the European Commission order new power lines to solve evident congestion? I think the answer is no, because the European Commission cannot really order anybody to build a power line. You want to add something on this?
I think you answered it already, Sylvia.
Okay, perfect. So then let's move to other questions again. How did you model the flow-based market coupling? And, for example, other aspects, which are the 2-day-ahead congestion forecast, the generation and load shift keys, and the advanced hybrid coupling. So the results, of course, will largely depend on how we assume all these aspects in the modeling.
Yes. Thanks for this question. There is more information on this in the report. So we stayed mainly in line in the flow-based market coupling, in the modeling of flow-based market coupling with what ENTSO-E is doing, for example, for ERA. We got a base case, which I would assume, which is more or less the equivalent to the 2-day and congestion forecast, but we use the nodal base case because there is this iterative issue that you need a market-based dispatch, and then you can do the flow-based domain based on it, and you need kind of a flow-based domain to have then this market-based dispatch. So the literature actually recommends to go with a nodal dispatch as the base case, and based on this base case we then calculated the zonal PTDFs and of course the PTDFs for the DC lines, how the flows on these lines affect the critical network elements. Of course, we also stayed in line with the 70% target, so we assumed that 70% is free on each CNEC. And yeah, I think that is basically it. Did I miss? I hope, yeah. Please, Sylvia, remind me if I missed an aspect on this.
I think we're fine. So another question, slide 16 shows a large increase in renewable energy sources, but only a moderate increase, about 33% in demand. And this seems to the person asking the question rather low. Have you checked the expectations on demand with other variable projections?
So we stayed in line with the impact assessment for the 2040 target. So the demand figures, they come from this assessment, and we simply use them, the official impact assessment.
Okay. Then another question still on the modeling. The backtesting on the 2020 redispatch is only valid for countries where there is the redispatch in 2020. But for country where there is few or no redispatch in 2020, this backtesting could not be very useful. So how do you, let's say, reply to this criticism?
So, of course, it is hard to validate if you do not have redispatch values in a certain country. However, it is already an information as well, for example, if you don't see any redispatch in the Baltics, that you, both in our model and in reality, that the model is staying consistent with this. Of course, it would be helpful to have additional indicators that we could use to compare it, but I think this is already a very good backtesting, and I think the fact that we are so close with our values really highlights that this is about the general trends. Of course, we are not claiming that we can to the decimal point forecast the redispatch in 2036, but for general trends, I think the model has proven to deliver quite robust results.
Okay, then some more general question. How much of an impact would the deployment of renewables in a grid-friendly way have? So, for example, if renewables are not installed where the energy production is the highest, but where the capacity is needed, the most true appropriate incentive and regulatory framework, how could this actually take place? The assumptions on the deployment of renewables in a grid-friendly way. So location-based, I suppose.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question, I think, and we are currently looking into this. So this is a little bit with a grain of salt because these are all preliminary results. But what we are seeing at the moment is that there is, in fact, the differences between deploying renewables to minimizing redispatch and deploying renewables to maximize renewable generation, and that there can be some contradictions. So if you wanted to reduce redispatch to the minimum, you would aim for installing as many renewables, so to really match demand with renewables, to have as much local consumption as possible. But this might actually lead to having more renewable deployment in areas with low resources. So what we see at the moment is that the optimum is to have something in between, that you optimize grid use. So it's not about minimizing grid use, it's optimizing grid use, and to install renewables where we have high capacity factors, but where we have also the grid capacity to deliver this energy to load centers.
Okay, Georg, I have also another a clarification on one of the questions that was previously asked. Actually, the person referring to the scenarios meant that the accelerated grid expansion should actually be our business as usual, because if we want to deploy renewables so fast, we would really need to match it with comparable fast deployment of the grid. So the business as usual should be the really worst case scenarios. This is just to complement what was already asked. Then if I would go on with two more questions about, again, the assumptions of the study. If we have maybe 1 more minute, and then I'm sorry, but we don't have more time for the other questions, but we can probably reply on a separate basis. So about the assumptions, do the studies assume that all the volumes of renewable energy sources will need to be transported? So everything that is produced, generated by the rest needs to be transported. Because, for example, offshore wind transportation capacity is already optimized to avoid additional grid investments. And also in the business as usual grid expansion scenario, when you have high variable renewable energy sources deployment, would this not distort the results? Because you again assume business as usual grid expansion, but on the other side, you have a very ambitious renewable energy sources deployment target. So I would focus on these two assumptions and then close the questions.
So I'm not 100% sure I get the second one. Let me answer the first one first. Of course, we do not assume that every megawatt hour of electricity has to be consumed that is produced by renewables. This is also reflected, of course, in this graph. So we have renewable curtailment, and there is also market-based curtailment. So whenever there's no demand for this electricity, then of course it gets curtailed and is simply not sold in the market. The second, I am not quite sure. I can also have a look at the slide if I understand what this means. Is this that the assumption being that Sylvia, can you elaborate again? I'm not sure.
There is a business as usual grid expansion, but you still basically look at it within a context of renewable energy sources with very, very demanding, let's say, ambitious goals. So if these two deployments of grids on one side and renewable energy sources on the other side are not aligned, maybe the results are still distorted.
Yes, I mean, this was the purpose of the study, to show that if we deploy renewables, first of all, grid expansion needs to take to keep pace. And of course, then also maybe we need to talk more about where we build renewables, how we build renewables, where we build hydrogen, and so on. So the renewables, they were a fixed parameter for us. They were a fixed boundary condition. And then we simply looked at different grid expansion scenarios. We did not say that there is a correlation between low grid expansion and low renewable build out, because also I think we cannot necessarily say this. For example, in Germany in the 2010s, we had periods with rapid renewable expansion, but grid expansion definitely did not take place. So I think we can assume that it's a possibility that grid expansion and renewable deployment are uncorrelated.
Okay, we are really running out of time, so I would kindly invite Christine to conclude. And of course, if Christoph also wants to add anything, we would be happy to hear. Thanks.
Many thanks for the interesting discussion.
Indeed, thanks presenters, and thanks also the audience. I'm really impressed that we have still over 200 people listening in, and we almost reached 300 at the top of the seminar. So we had two very interesting reports, and seeing the rich exchange, I'm sure that the authors will be happy to continue answering questions. Possibly in chat, not in chat, but on Slido. Also, I was asked to remind that the recording of this seminar will be available shortly, probably tomorrow. So you can invite also other colleagues and interested researchers to pay attention. So what we learned from it is that forecasting future is very difficult, and we have to be very, very, very careful with our assumptions. And that congestion is really the key issue that we have to resolve if we want to achieve our targets, basically. So with this, I think I have reached the end of our allocated time. And as Sylvia was suggesting, maybe our long established partners from ACER want to still come in. If not, I just say introduce myself, what I didn't do. I'm Christine Flaxma. I'm head of unit in GRCC3. We are focusing on energy security, distribution, and markets. And we have worked with ACER for a really long time. And this is not our first such collaboration. So, Christoph, I saw you coming in.
Yeah, not necessarily, but just to thank Ivana, Ignacio Gorch for the excellent presentation, and Ivana for the support, and you, Patrick, and Sylvia, and you as well, Christine, for the excellent cooperation with GRC. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we will remain available we'll try to answer all your questions in writing. And we will remain available if you want to further discuss all this topic with us. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you indeed.